你好，早上好，我姓黑叫 Jack，这位是我的太太 Vivian. Thank you so much for having us. Let's pray.
我们一起来祷告。
God, we need you more than ever today.
主啊，我们今日，需要你比以往任何时候都更加需要。
For without you, we are nothing.
主啊，没有你，我们什么都不是。
Forgive me for my sin
主啊，赦免我的罪。
and use this time to benefit this congregation.
主啊，求你使用这个时间去祝福我们的会众。
May your word be clear to them and may it give them hope.
主啊，愿你的话语对他们的心清晰明了，愿你亲自给他们盼望。
Give Vivian words to say as well
主啊，求你给我，当说的话。
so that you may be understood.
主啊，所以，你的子民可以去理解你。
And we pray this all in the name of Jesus Christ.
我们祈求祷告是奉救主耶稣基督的圣名。
Amen.
阿门。
Here we are in 2021. 2020 is gone.
我们来到了2021年，2020年已经成为过去。
In many people's minds, they are thankful to see this year behind them.
在许多人心里面，他们都感恩这样的一年过去了。
2021 holds hope for many people.
2021年，承载着许多人的盼望。
Hope in new vaccines, leaders, hope in racial changes and economic changes.
承载着对新疫苗的盼望，对国家领袖、对种族问题得到改善、经济能够复苏的盼望。
Though it is just a day, this new year brings hope that life may be normal again.
虽然辞旧迎新，跨年仅仅是一天，但是这样的一天却给人们带来盼望，盼望生活可以再次恢复正常。
Hope that we can gather as a church, as friends, that classes will be in person.
盼望我们作为教会，作为友邻，可以再次实体相聚，也盼望可以回到教室重新上课。
Maybe your hopes are simpler, that the rent can be paid, that you can focus on your studies.
也许你的盼望比这些都更加简单，盼望交得上房租，盼望可以专心在学业上面，盼望可以回到家里与家人团聚。
Maybe you just want to go home to see your family.
也许你真的只是想，真的盼望着能够回家见到家人。
These are all good things to hope for.
这些都是值得盼望的美好事情。
And we have a lot of similarities with the Israelites, the main audience for today's passage, Zechariah 14.
那其实就盼望来讲，我们和撒迦利亚书14章最初的听众以色列人有许多的相似之处。
For before Zechariah 14, the book has been largely filled with hope.
因为撒迦利亚书全卷绝大部分一直到14章以前都是饱含希望的。
And Israel itself had just left Babylonian exile 20 years before.
因为那时以色列人离开被掳也才20年左右的时间。
The temple was being rebuilt. The population of Jerusalem was starting to grow. The laws of God were being re-implemented.
圣殿正在被重建，耶路撒冷的人口正在逐渐增长，神的律法也在被重新的重视并且施行。
There was much to look forward to. We and the Israelites both had many things going for us.
对以色列人当时来说呢，他们有许多值得盼望的事情，就如同我们今天的我们一样。
But our hope is not in vaccines or leaders or governments.
但是我们的盼望不在于疫苗，也不在于国家的领袖，也不在于政府。
Just like Israel's hope was not in the temple or in the growing numbers of Jerusalem.
就正如以色列的盼望，其实并不能在于圣殿或者耶路撒冷人口的增长。
Our hope is in the coming of Jesus Christ.
我们的盼望是在于主耶稣基督的再来。
We can try and replace this hope with things of the world, but they will let you down.
我们可以尝试去用这个世界的东西去取代如此的一个真盼望，但是不管是什么，都一定会让你失望的。
During this hope sermon, I hope to give you a true hope to imagine.
在今天的正道过程当中，我希望能够帮助你去想象这样的一个真正的盼望。
That you will be able to imagine Zechariah 14 to see the future hope of Christ's coming.
你可以去想象，就如撒迦利亚14章告诉我们的这样，去想象一个基督再临的未来。
And Zechariah 14, as you heard earlier, is very confusing and dense.
当你听到撒迦利亚14章这样的信息的时候，可能会感到非常的这样的信息非常的浓缩，非常的让人困惑难以理解。
For prophets often are talking about things that will happen in the near future for Israel. Sometimes they are talking about things that will happen in Christ's time, and other times things that have not yet come to pass.
因为先知书它记载的事情，很多时候都是有时候在讲就近的将来，然后马上就跳到一个较远的将来，然后再跳到一个基督的时候。
What makes this prophecy even more confusing is it's not in a chronological order.
让这段经文尤为人困惑的地方在于，它其实并没有按照它没有一个时间的顺序。
But what God really wants us to learn from a text like this is that our hope is in his coming.
但是神要教导我们的，通过这样的经文，要让我们学习的是，我们真正的盼望在于他的再来。
And it asks this fundamental question, what does the end look like?
这段经文问了一个很根本的问题，就是这个世界的末了，这个末世到底是什么样子的？
And for Zechariah, it has 14 different events.
那撒迦利亚书第14章呢，记载了4个事件的进程。
The first is the Lord fights the nations.
第一个是主耶和华神会与列国征战。
The second is the Lord will return.
第二件事是主耶和华神会自己归来。
The third is the Lord will be king.
第3件事是主耶和华神会作王。
The fourth is the Lord will make holy.
第4件事主耶和华神会使一切成为圣洁。
So the Lord fights the nations and he will return to be king to make holy.
所以到末世的时候，主耶和华神会亲自与列国征战，他会亲自归来，他会亲自作王，他会亲自使一切成为圣洁。
The Lord defeats the nations is this first point, and we're going to start there, and it begins in verse 1 and 3.
那我们从第1点开始，经文1到3节讲述，主耶和华神如何击败如何与列国征战。
And remember, Israel had just come out of exile, and now we will see that Zechariah is predicting another exile.
我们要记得这段经文当时的背景是，以色列人其实刚脱离被掳的命运，并没有多久，但是现在先知撒迦利亚居然又在预言另一次被掳了。
Looking at verse 1, behold, a day is coming for the Lord, when the spoil taken from you will be divided in your midst.
第1节经文讲，耶和华的日子临近，你的财物必被抢掠，在你中间分散。
And this day of the Lord formula happens all throughout the prophets.
那这个短语耶和华的日子，其实在所有的先知书里面都有频繁的出现。
And here the emphasis is that it is happening soon.
在此处呢，他强调的是耶和华的日子临近了，
Soon all the things Israel treasured will be taken from them.
马上以色列所宝贝的财物，各样的所属于他们的东西都会被仇敌所抢掠。
And now we move to verse 2, we see that God is the one who gathers the nations to destroy Jerusalem.
接着我们看到第2节经文，其实讲到主耶和华神就是那一位聚集万国来与耶路撒冷征战的。
And we see it goes from a large unit from the city to the house to the women being raped.
而且这个征战的范围，从由大到小，我们看到是从城被攻取，然后从城到房屋被抢夺，然后从房屋到妇女被玷污。
At the end of this, there is exile.
这节的末尾告诉我们，当这样的征战发生以后呢，城中民一半会被掳去。
The original audience would have been horrified to hear verses 1 and 2.
那这段信息最初的听众呢，在听到这样的内容的时候，一定会非常的恐慌，
These graphic images would have been fresh in the imaginations.
因为对于他们来说，这些残暴的、残忍的战争画面，对于他们来说仍然是记忆犹新的。
Babies being thrown against walls, streets literally running with blood.
残忍到什么程度呢？婴孩被摔到墙上摔死，街道上血流成河。
There is no rules of engagement in the ancient Near East.
在古代中东的战争上面呢，人们是真的是残忍残暴，不留任何余地的。
The wickedness of man is on display, inflicting pain for pure spite and wickedness.
从这里面，我们真的能看到人的恶真的是，没有底线的，单单是就是可以去任意的折磨，给他人制造无端痛苦。
These are things animals do not even do.
连畜生都真的做不到的事情，都不会做的事情，人却可以。
But in the midst of this pain, we see a sliver of hope because in the end of verse 2, we see that not everyone is going into exile this time.
但即使是在这样悲惨的一个画面之中，我们看到经文最后其实有一丝丝的希望，因为他说到剩下的民仍在城中不致剪除，不是所有的人都会被掳。
Jesus speaks of this hope also in Luke. And when he says that kingdoms will rise against kingdoms.
主耶稣在路加福音里面就讲的末世的事情，他讲的是国与国到时国必攻打国，民必攻打民。
Earthquakes and diseases, he say, will come.
主耶稣说到末世的时候，会有地震，会有饥荒，会有疾病流行。
And if we apply this to us, what if America falls? If there is another COVID-like disease or the world falls apart?
那对于我们现在来说，就好比美国突然间衰亡、分崩离析，像新冠病毒一样的病毒再来一个，再来袭这个世界。
Jesus points to this, that when people are fainting with fear and with foreboding of what is to come, that is when we should straighten up and raise heads because our redemption is drawing near.
但主耶稣他说的意思是，当末世这样悲惨的事情不断的发生的时候，人想起那将要临到世界的事，就都吓得魂不附体。但是对于他的子民来说，这恰恰是我们要挺起腰、抬起头的时候，因为我们的救恩临近了，主就要来了。
Just like the Israelites, it seemed like the end had come, but yet redemption was near at hand.
对以色列人来说是相似的，因为他们的盼望在于神，就是因为末尾的日子临近了，他们可以因着救恩而喜悦。
For a commentator put it this way, man is having his day now, the Lord's day is yet to come.
正如一个圣经学者所说，人在他的日子也许可以为所欲为，但是耶和华的日子就要来了。
And we see this in verse 3. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as when he fights on a day of battle.
我们也看到第3节，接着讲说，那时耶和华必出去与那些国征战，好像从前征战一样。
So the Lord goes out against the nations that were gathered to fight Jerusalem.
所以神他会亲自与这些与耶路撒冷征战的列国，他亲自来征战。
A struggle isn't mentioned, just victory.
我们看到经文里面其实并没有提到任何征战或者争斗的细节，仅只提到胜利。
Just like in Revelation 19 through 20, we see Satan and God lining up to battle, and then Satan is captured.
这就好像启示录19章19到20节所记载的一样，当撒旦起来与神征战，撒旦的失败是自动的，是直接的，是立即的，因为神永远是得胜的。
This verse teaches us that when our God battles, he is victorious.
这些经文教导我们，当我们的神起来征战的时候，他永远是得胜的。
God uses the folly of the nations to defeat them.
神使用这些列国的愚妄去击败他们。
And after this, the text turns to the Lord's return, and it causes physical changes on the earth. And there are 2 separate occasions in this text.
这些经文之后，我们看到来到第2点，讲的是神的归来。
The first is after the battle in verse 4, we see the physical return of God coming to the Mount of Olives.
这个主神的归来，这里着重强调了2个方面啊。第一个方面是主的归来，主亲自的脚踏在橄榄山上。
Now, the Mount of Olives was a mountain outside of Jerusalem, and it is the same mountain Jesus ascends from after his resurrection.
橄榄山是一座在耶路撒冷城外的山，而恰恰就是在这座橄榄山上，主耶稣在复活以后，这是主耶稣复活以后升天的地方。
After his resurrection in Acts, an angel speaks to the apostles and says, "Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking in heaven? This Jesus who was taken up from you into heaven will come in the same way you saw him go into heaven."
在使徒行传里面第一章第11节有记载说，当主耶稣升天以后，门徒还站在那里望着天，然后天使向他们显现，对他们说：加利利人呐，你们为什么站着望天呢？这离开你们被接升天的耶稣，你们见他怎样往天上去，他还要怎样来。
This is that return. This is the hope that the world tries to replace.
主耶稣天使所说的那个他还要怎样来 撒加利亚书这里写的就是主就要那样来，就要他怎样从橄榄山上升上去，还会有怎样从橄榄山回到橄榄山上。这个盼望，这个瞬间，恰恰就是这个世界用各种东西想要去替代的这样的一个盼望。
The moment all creation yearns for is when God's feet touches the earth again.
这个瞬间是一切的受造之物切望等候的主再来的那个瞬间。当神的脚踏在地。
And this first physical change is actually, it splits the mountain of Olives in two into this wide valley.
那我们知道，我们看到神的归来带来这个世界上产生的这物质性上的变化哈。当神脚踏在地，大山裂开两半。
And the second change is a greater change, and it happens to the natural order of the world.
那第二个所带来的变化呢，是直接是自然受造的这个秩序，主的再来会给自然受造的秩序带来改变。
And we see it in verses 6 and 7. On that day, there shall be no light, cold, or frost. And there shall be a unique day, which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night, but at evening time there shall be light.
我们看第6节、第7节讲到说，那日必没有光，三光必退缩，那日必是耶和华所知道的，不是白昼，也不是黑夜，到了晚上才有光明。
These verses remind us that God is in control of the world.
这些经文提醒我们，神对这个世界完全掌权。
Let there be light is undone, the first act of creation. Day and night are no more.
神创造世界的时候，第一个举动、第一个命令要有光，现在被解除了。
But it says there will be light in the evening, and that's very perplexing.
不再有白昼，也不再有黑夜，但是到了晚上才有光明，这是很有意思的一点。
The light is God, and it's explained in Revelation 21:23. No need of sun or moon to shine on it, it being Jerusalem, for the glory of God gives it light, and its lamp is the Lamb.
这个光从哪里来呢？这个光就是神，就是上帝。正如启示录21章23节告诉我们的那样，那城内又不用日月光照，因有神的荣耀光照，又有羔羊为城的灯。
God will be our light in the last day.
神在末了的时候会做我们的光。
Furthermore, in Zechariah 14:8, we see, on that day, living water shall flow out from Jerusalem, half of them to the eastern sea and half of them to the western sea. It shall continue in summer and winter.
接着看第8节，那日必有活水从耶路撒冷出来，一半往东海流，一半往西海流，冬夏都是如此。
Light and water are important things. They're important things that you need to create food with.
那光和水都是极其重要的元素，在农业社会，为了所以因着光和水，所以人们可以种，可以丰收，可以吃得上东西。
This abundance of water fixes the problem that the river of Siloam gave Jerusalem, which was a very small, tiny bit of water.
这个活水解决了水源不足的问题，因为耶路撒冷呢，它赖以生存的只有是一条并不大的河，叫做希罗亚河，在耶路撒冷城外。但是现在这个丰盛的活水就解决了水源不足的问题。
But God doesn't just give them water, he gives them living waters. And who calls himself living waters?
但是神不只是供应了水而已，这一些到是必有活水从耶路撒冷出来，那谁又是这位活水呢？
Jesus is those living waters, as he calls himself in the Feast of Booths and at the woman at the well in John.
主耶稣就是这个活水，在2个地方他亲自宣告，向世人宣告他是活水。第一个地方是在一次守住棚节的时候，第二次是在约翰福音第4章记载他在井边和一个撒玛利亚人的相遇。
And we see this partially fulfilled as Jesus goes out amongst the world, healing the nations.
我们就看到这节经文就是对主耶稣，他说他是活水那个预言的成全。他作为活水从耶路撒冷流出来，流向全世界，医治整个世界。
Now, light and water, as we talked about before, are both necessary for agricultural work.
那我们刚才提到过了，光和水对于农作来说都是非常重要的元素。
And notice that there is now a lack of frost or cold, and actually the river never freezes. There's an abundance of water all the time.
现在这个活水就源源不断的流，不会有 寒冷，也不会有霜降，就象征了丰盛。
What this means for Jerusalem is that it will always have plenty.
这对耶路撒冷来说，就是他们永永远远都会有充足的水源。
So if you are struggling to make ends meet, you can look to the hope that one day God will give you all you need.
所以，如果你有在某些方面的缺乏，这些经文就带给我们希望说，即使我们现在有缺乏，但是到那日到神的日子，我们神必会充充足足的供应给我们。
So these passages teach us that God is in control of the physical world and it will be restored.
而且这几节经文最重要的是提醒我们，神才是对这个物质世界最终的掌权者。
So now we move away from, so God returns and there are physical changes to the world. And now we will see that the Lord is king in the third point.
那现在我们讲了，当神归来的时候，会在这个世界上产生很多物理性、物质上面的变化。那不止如此，他归来以后，他要做王。
So like the Lord's return affects the world, now the true king, when he returns, actually affects the people who dwell there.
那不止神的归来要影响这个物理上的世界，神更要影响他的子民。
And first, we look at he provides safety and abundance that no earthly ruler can provide.
在接下来的经文当中，9到10，还有11，还有12，我们看到，主耶和华会为他的人民带来安定和平安。
So verse 10 is where we see that Jerusalem is being made into a plain, and each point of the compass is being flattened.
我们看到第10节，它其实讲的是耶路撒冷会被变为平地了。
And this would have removed the physical defenses of Jerusalem because Jerusalem doesn't need it anymore.
他的意思是，耶路撒冷所有的这些为了作为保护的这些屏障都会被移除，因为到了那日，耶路撒冷神的城将不再需要任何的这样屏障的保护。
So while the world's leaders have to continue to build armies, they have to build walls, they have to lie and manipulate, our God comes in front of all and removes what we once needed to protect ourselves.
所以我们想到这个世上的君王，千方百计不惜，付出谎言和操控，他人的这样的代价呢，为了去守护他们国家的安全，扩大军备，修建城墙。但是到了神的日子，任何的这些保护都不再需要了，因为神他自己就是我们的保护。
And God also fills the city with people.
而且神是会让人充满他的城。
For there would have been a steady trickle of Jewish people coming out of Babylon, but now the city is full.
然后我们知道当以色列人他们经历被掳，还有各样就是真的是悲惨的事情，他们的人口其实一直都很少，但是现在不会再那样了，神的子民将会充满神的城。
And we can identify this when we think about our empty churches, our streets and businesses, and look forward to when these are filled once more.
其实我们可以感同身受，因为我们是多么的盼望，我们空着的教堂、空着的学校、空着的街道，可以再次被人们所填满的。
But no earthly king, president, prime minister can offer you this safety and peace.
但是世上没有任何一个君王，没有任何一个掌权者，没有任何一个领袖和统治者可以保证，像经文里面所讲的这样的，平安、祥和和安定。
The second way the king affects the world is those who opposed him, he gives a plague and panic.
那另外一个方面呢，神作为王者归来，他怎么样影响到这个世上的人呢？是他会用灾殃，我们看到12节，他会用灾殃去攻击那与耶路撒冷征战的列国人。
The plague is described here in verse 12, and this shall be the plague that with which the Lord will strike all the peoples that wage war against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot while they are standing on their feet. Their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongues will rot in their mouths.
四如12节讲到，耶和华用灾殃攻击那与耶路撒冷征战的列国人，必是这样：他们两脚站立的时候，肉必消没，眼在眶中干瘪，舌在口中溃烂。
The plague removes their autonomy, right? Their feet are no longer able to move.
他的意思是，这样的灾殃其实拿去他们一切自主的能力，动弹都动弹不了，做人也做不得。
The eyes, which represented spiritual and mental clarity in the ancient Near East, are taken away.
眼睛在古代世界，它是象征着看见、接触、认知这个世界的能力，但是如此的能力要被神拿走。
The tongue, which represents speech, is also taken.
那舌头它象征的是，能够讲话、交通、沟通、交流的能力，到时也会被拿走。
So not only are they afflicted with the plague, God also sends a panic among them.
而且我们看到，不只是神会用灾殃攻击，他还会使他们大大扰乱，
And this shows the nations fighting one another.
列国彼此揪住、彼此攻击。
And in the midst of this, Israel's spoils are returned to them.
在列国彼此攻击的时候，犹大和耶路撒冷，他们当时所被抢掠的财物，现在被归据、收据，回到他们那里。
The spoils that were taken in verse 1 are returned to Israel.
我们看到第14章第1节讲述的那些耶路撒冷他们被抢掠的财物，现在被归还了。
Remember that whatever the world takes from us in this lifetime, we have hope God will restore it in the future.
请大家记住，不管在这个世界上，这个世界夺去我们什么，我们在这个世界上失去了什么，最终神一定都会以他的方式归还给我们。
And the last act of this king is he brings the survivors into his kingdom.
那当神王者归来，他做的最后一件事情是，聚集这些剩下的民把他们带领进入他的国度。
He reconciles those who fought against him, and in the end, he brings them to worship him.
神将那些曾经与他征战的人，与他和好，而且他带他们去敬拜，去他的城敬拜他，并且守住棚节。
He brings them to do what all humans should do, which is to worship them, and he does it during the Feast of Booths.
神带领这些剩下的民去敬拜他，去做这个人被受造的目的的最本分的事情就是敬拜。
Now, the Feast of Booths encapsulates a lot of the aspects of this passage.
而且还有敬拜，并且守住棚节。那守住棚节呢，其实集这段经文的很多要点于一身呢。
For the Tabernacle Festival, it's celebrated an abundant harvest.
因为住棚节是以色列犹太人的一个节庆，是庆祝丰收。
Gentiles, who are non-Jewish people, were actually able to go and celebrate with Jewish people during this time.
即使是外邦人，就是非以色列的人，他们也可以在这个节庆和以色列一起上耶路撒冷去庆祝。
And they also, during Jesus' time, they'd go to that little river Siloam, and they'd bring the water up to the temple.
所以在主耶稣的时代他们怎么守住棚节呢？他们以色列人和外邦人会一起到西罗亚河水去，把西罗亚的河水带到圣殿里面去。
Remember, it is the same festival that Jesus says, I am the living water.
就是在守住棚节的时候，主耶稣向神宣告说：“我就是活水。”
But the text seems to give a choice to the nations.
但是经文好像也体现了，这里好像各国还是可以做一个选择。
For those nations who don't go up, they can choose that, and the plague afflicts them.
有人选择去敬拜神，有人选择不去敬拜神。但是选择不敬拜的人的不敬拜神的人的话呢，灾殃又会有灾祸临到他们。
Even more, it will not rain on them.
写到必无雨降在他们的地上。
And so Egypt is highlighted here because though they relied on irrigation, the plague would still afflict them.
而且18节尤其的提到埃及，为什么这个意味着什么呢？是因为埃及它其实并不是依赖降雨，因为它有尼罗河的灌溉。但是这节经文的意思是说，即使如果埃及选择不去敬拜神的话呢，即使他们不依赖雨水，这个灾祸同样的也会临到他们。
And this is where I will challenge you. Will you be one to go up and worship at the Feast of Booths?
所以我想用一个问题来挑战你：你会去做，去敬拜、去庆祝的那一位吗？
For there are those who go up and those who refuse. There isn't a third category.
因为只有两个选择，会有人选择去敬拜神，会有人选择不去敬拜。
A choice has to be made. Will you refuse the water of life and wither away?
没有中间地带，没有第三选择。嗯，所以你会选择去拒绝这生命的活水，就此枯萎吗？
Losing your ability to walk straight ways, to see the truth and speak truth?
你会想要失去，就好像前面的经文所说，失去行走的能力，失去做人的能力，失去认知、讲述真理的能力吗？
I invite you to today to believe in those living waters, Jesus Christ.
我恳请你今天能够信靠主耶稣，就是主耶稣就是生命的活水，
Come and worship him today.
今天就来敬拜他。
Again, you cannot sit this one out.
你不能对这个选择视而不见，
Don't wait, for remember the day of the Lord is coming.
不要再等待了，因为主耶和华的日子就要来临。
Believe that Jesus Christ is the Lord of the world who died to reconcile us to him.
相信主耶稣基督就是世界的主，他为了我们的罪而死，为了是要我们与神和好。
But to be reconciled to God requires that we are made holy.
但是为了与神和好，因为神是圣洁的神，所以我们也必须成为圣洁。
And this brings us to our final point that the Lord makes holy.
那就是把我们带到了最后一个要点，就是主耶和华神再来的时候，他会使一切成为圣洁。
For God starts with making things holy at the smallest level.
我们从经文看到神从最小最微不足道的事情开始，让他们变成圣洁。
And we see in verse 20, and on that day there shall be inscribed on the bells of the horses, holy to the Lord, and the pots in the house of the Lord shall be as the bowls before the altar.
经文20节写道：“当那日，马的铃铛上必有归耶和华为圣的这句话。耶和华殿内的锅必如祭坛前的碗一样。”
The priest's headpiece at one point in the Old Testament was required to say, holy to the Lord.
在旧约里面，我们知道，祭司，这句归耶和华为圣是要写在祭司的头顶上的。
And now the bell on a smelly common beast of burden and a terrible beast of war reads, holy to the Lord.
但是现在这句圣洁的话，象征圣洁的话，居然写在了一个微不足道的，又脏又臭的家畜的铃铛上面，马的铃铛上面。
God can take a horse bell and make it holy. How much more can he make us holy through our sin and wickedness?
如果神能把这样的一个低等的、微不足道的马的铃铛，都能变为圣洁，那神又是多愿意，把我们从罪中、从我们的污秽中和不堪中拯救出来，成为圣洁呢？
And God doesn't stop there. In fact, it goes from a small unit again to a larger unit. So the bells are made holy, and now it reads, every pot in the house of the Lord shall be as the bowls before the altar.
而且神没有停在那里，我们看到从马的铃铛，这样的小的东西上面，一直往上扩展到更大的东西。耶和华殿内的锅，必如祭坛前的碗一样。
An ordinary pot that we use to cook congee will be the same as a pot that held the blood of the atonement.
想想我们用来盛粥的碗，家里的锅碗瓢盆，到时神会使他们成为圣洁，就好像祭坛前盛血的碗一样。
And God continues to expand this. So now it is, and every pot in Jerusalem and Judah shall be holy to the Lord of hosts.
而且这个范围继续的在扩展，看到21节写到，凡耶路撒冷和犹大的锅都必归万军之耶和华为圣。
All Jerusalem and Judah, this once divided nation, become a temple.
耶路撒冷和犹大这些曾经一分为二的两个王国，如今可以合一，一起成为神的圣殿。
And we read further in verse 21, so that all who sacrifice may come and take of them and boil the meat of the sacrifice in them. And there shall no longer be a traitor in the house of the Lord of hosts on that day.
我们继续看21节的后半段，讲凡献祭的都必来取这锅，煮肉在其中。当那日，在万军之耶和华的殿中，必不再有迦南人。
It mentions trader here because normally during festivals like the Feast of Booths, commodities would have been impossible to find.
这个地方我要解释一下，因为我们中文圣经写的迦南人，其实它的意思是讲说，在节庆的时候，嗯，会有许多人在圣殿里面做买卖，因为所有的人都来庆祝这个锅碗瓢盆这些东西就被这些人哄抬物价，然后就很不容易找到，就变得很贵，然后穷苦的人就没有办法去有这些渠道去一起来庆祝。
There's now ample provision for everyone, both poor and rich, Jew and Gentile.
但是现在就不会了，会有丰盛的供应给所有的人，给所有的人都可以都可以拿到这些东西，然后一起来庆祝。
Now remember, Jews would not have been able to eat with Gentiles, but now both Jew and Gentile eat sacrifices with one another before God.
而且呢，我们知道犹太人他和外邦人是因为他们犹太人是被分别为圣，他们是不可以和外邦人一起吃的。但是在这里呢，我们看到犹太人和外邦人都在神面前一起来敬拜，一起来庆祝。
You experience this when you come to the table of communion to celebrate the death of Jesus.
那如今的我们呢，在参与圣餐的时候，可以有类似的体验，得到这个将来的这个体验的一瞥，就是弟兄姐妹主内肢体，因着信心因着神的救赎，一起来到神的面前去领受神的身体，神的宝血。
For we have been unified from all over the world in the Lord.
因为我们被从全世界聚集起来在主里面。
This passage ends with on that day. So, despite the day of the Lord at the beginning, which looked like the demise of Israel, instead, Israel and the world is blessed and exceeds all expectations.
这里尤为的提到那个短语“当那日”，又让我们联想到14章第1节说耶和华的日子，这就是前后呼应，告诉我们说，以色列作为神的选民，神给他们的祝福现在扩展到全世界。
In the end of the world, we have hope.
所以在最终的最终，我们是有盼望的人。
The fact that the Lord will return as king to make his people holy is true.
我们的盼望就基于一个事实，什么事实呢？就是主他会亲自归来，亲自做王，亲自使他的子民成为圣洁。
The Lord defeats his enemies and he will defeat our enemies too.
耶和华在他的日子会与他的仇敌征战，会与耶路撒冷的仇敌征战，他也会与我们的仇敌征战。
We see that God is in charge of the physical world, so he is in charge of COVID too.
而且我们看到神他是对这个物质世界掌权的那一位，所以他也对新冠病毒掌权。
So as we look to the hope of the new year, and let's hope and pray there is peace and end to the COVID, realize that there is true peace and hope at the returning of our King.
所以在我们展望新一年的时候，我们当然盼望也祈祷，这场疫情可以尽快的过去。但是我们更要意识到，真正的平安和真正的盼望在于主耶稣的再来。
And I pray that even if this year is worse than last year, or even if it is better, that you can take hope in our true hope, the future of Christ's coming.
我为你祈祷，不管接下来的一年是比之前更糟，还是比之前会更好，你都可以把你真正的盼望，放在主耶稣的再来上面。
May the Lord be with us.
愿主与我们同